I think this point has been made before today, that the mining industry has come a long way. There used to be a time that we patted ourselves on the back when we complied with environmental law. And these days, we've gone through all sorts of cycles of progress, and now we all know that environmental compliance alone is not good enough, and we seek to exist in peace with our partners or the community that hosts us. But even as we talk more about sustainability, I think sustainability means different things to different people. So in order to make sure that we are all on the same page, I want to take a moment to talk about what at least I think sustainability means. This here are the UN Sustainable Development Goals, so has nothing to do with mining. But I think taking that framework and applying it to mineral development for a country makes a lot of sense. And I will use that to set the stage for what I mean by sustainable development, and therefore what the discussions around that mean. So, in addition to that, ICMM, which includes a lot of our large mining companies, has its 10 principles for mineral development. And these 10 principles, you can fairly well match these principles to the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN set. So this figure, for example, is ICMM's attempt at matching the 10 development principles that ICMM has with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. But for this afternoon's talk, in simple terms, I would say that any mineral development that contributes to the development goals that the UN sets, I would define as sustainable mining, right? So if you develop your mineral resources in a manner that contributes to your sustainable development goals that the UN's or all member nations set, then I would say that that is sustainably being developed. Now, having said that, and even though I agree that the industry has made lots of progress in the last 30 years or so, there are still challenges. We still have conflicts, we still have communities up in arms against mining companies, and issues still exist. And so that's why we keep talking about it, and that's why we try to continue to improve. Next slide. So, going specific first to the professional societies and then to researchers, these are things that I think professional societies such as WAIMM can do in the bid to help promote sustainable development. Right? So I would say developing standards so that members, professionals that belong to these standards can adhere to developing code of ethics, disseminating what best practices are so that members could use those best practices in their professional work. And then facilitating the discussion like we are doing today, facilitating discussion on what the current best practices are, what the current research needs are, so we can move forward is relevant. Let me take a moment to talk about ethics briefly, because I think that's something that this society is low-hanging fruit, right, that we can handle. All these headlines are true, I didn't make them up, right? All these are relevant news stories. I think some of you know that I spent some time at the US SEC on my sabbatical, and I met an accountant there who was, for me, one of the best mining finance people I've met. And he told me a joke, but it makes sense. He said, a mine is a hole with a rascal on top of it. And the point he was making is it was coming out of his frustration dealing with scammers that are setting up shell companies, calling them mining companies just so that they can get some money in their own pocket. And of course, most of those people get mining engineers and geologists to write reports for them that back up the valuation of the mineral property that's the basis of their so-called mining claim. But I'm saying that to say we have a profession that requires us to act ethically, otherwise we would have problems. So I think that's a real issue that we need to address the ethics. And I'm using the National Society of Professional Engineers, similar to chartered engineers in the UK. In the United States, this is just a preamble of their code of ethics, and some the first 6 canons of their ethics as an illustration. These are things that, as professionals, whether we are geologists or engineers, scientists, whatever our role is in the mineral sector, these are things that we should aspire to do so that the stories that I just showed, at least at a minimum, the frequency of these stories reduce. Switching gears to research, which at least I can attest to, I think researchers too have a role to play in the sense that researchers can address these things, right? It's our job as researchers at the various universities, government institutions that do research to ensure that we explore the questions that still remain unanswered with respect to what the sustainable development impact of mining are. We also need to develop better sustainable development metrics to measure ourselves against, because part of the problem when we measure sustainability in the mining industry is we often tend to use metrics that have been developed for other industries to measure mining, and it's usually not contextually the best way to measure our sustainable development metrics, and so we pose problems. And then once we have developed these practices, what best practices are, it's also important to then disseminate that information so that professionals and minds, especially the less endowed ones, can have the ability to use the best practices, global best practices. Because the problem with mining is when we get a bad reputation, even if it's one company that messes up, it affects all of the industry. So it's just not enough for the large ones that have the deep pockets to understand what these linkages between mining activity and sustainable development is. It's actually important that there's real meaningful technology transfer, that the research results that others are finding out go to the entire community. I wanted to take a moment to talk about an example of how research can advance some of the practices, some of the best practices. And I don't know how many of you are aware, but some of the large companies, at least where I work, one of the new exciting things that's happening with community engagement is the idea of using social media together with advanced analytics and computer modeling to actually gain intelligence. So, not to advertise for anyone, but I know at least one large consulting house, for instance, that if you hire would use text analysis of social media to actually warn you ahead if there's negative press brewing on social media on your project. So say you have a project in Ghana and suddenly there's a lot of negative attention being drawn on Facebook or Twitter, that you would actually get that intelligence ahead of time. So there are some of us that are doing this sort of computer modeling, analytical modeling, and this is one of the areas that I have been working on how we understand community preferences, so individual preferences within the community, and then how, because measuring those preferences is somewhat easier, but more importantly, how do we know that, or try to predict how those preferences change over time, right? So, being a mine planning guy myself, I think one of the usefulness of this is we tend to make all these design choices all the time, and it's easy to evaluate how those design choices impact the economics of the project, but it's not always easy to evaluate how those design choices impact the community perceptions. You know, I've listed a coal mine, for example, that has almost an island in the middle of the coal mine because there's a native cemetery underneath that coal, so they didn't mine that coal. Now, of course, that's money that they left behind, but the question is whether they mined it, would that have led to, even if there was compensation or moving the cemetery, would that have led to such an uproar that it was worth it to leave that resource in the ground? How do we understand those things? So in this case, these are the things that we sought to do. We are using multi-agent modeling or agent-based modeling together with something called discrete choice theory, and then describing social networks in a quantitative form. We are then able to model, to the extent that you can actually model human behavior, and then simulate what different scenarios would arise when information diffusion happens in these communities. So quickly, a brief overview of what discrete choice theory is. We essentially, instead of going to people and asking them, do you like this mine over that mine, or why do you like that mine or that mine? We're essentially using instruments that look something like this. So you're going to pose people, give them different kinds of mines and say which one would you prefer. And by repetitively asking them which one of these choices would you prefer, we're actually able to model indirectly what their preferences look like. And then you can use, so that's one of the tools we are using, and then we are using that model in our computer model of the community. So the results I'm showing here is a case study. Again, for the mining folks, Salt Lake City is home to the large copper mine, the big BM Kenyan mine. So we are using BM Kenyan for our case study. This is work that a recent PhD graduate that worked with me did. So, I mean, these are the number of people, the demographics and all that we. And then these are the results, right? So based on a similar instrument to what I showed, the simplified version, by asking them about different mines, we are then able to infer from that result, for example, that if you look on that slide, say the economic factor, job opportunities, is a much more important factor to the people we interviewed at least than say water pollution, right? Because the coefficient for job opportunities is 1.1, whereas water pollution is only 0.19. So even though in fact we had done a previous study where we had just asked them to rank how important each of these factors is, and all those factors, when they just had to rank, is water pollution important to you, everybody ranked it high. But when we actually gave them numbers and said, you're going to have a mine that employs only 300 people versus a mine that employs 600 people, or you can have a bit of pollution, as they had to actually make trade-offs, we could then infer that job opportunities are actually much more important to them. The beauty of this is, as a mine, not that this replaces your community engagement program, but this provides you the hard data around which you can actually have the conversations. So you are not guessing what kind of conversations you should be having, but you know the conversations that drive the preferences within the community. Even aside from the numerical modeling, this kind of effort on its own is meaningful. Yeah, this is for the academic folks. So for those that want to read papers that we have published as a result of that, that's for next slide. But then we are going to do agent-based modeling where we are going to pretend we can recreate human behavior, but we're going to use that equation that came from that earlier research to then drive what the agent behavior is. Next slide. And then this is us. If someone is really interested, I can talk. I don't want to, for the interest of time, but essentially this is us showing or proving that at this stage, the model is replicating what we observed among the people. So when we did the survey, the status quo was chosen about 44% of the time, and on average, we also get about 45% of the time our agent-based modeling predicting the same. But then, since this whole effort is to try and understand what happens when people start talking within the community, so if there's some bad news or good news, whichever there is, and people start talking within the community, and that information diffuses over time, and really the effort here is to understand, given your community, how quickly things can change for you. When you have bad news, say a cyanide spill or tailings dam accident, how quickly can opinions change for you? Is more what we are interested in. So then we also have to think about the social networks involved, and then the diffusion models involved. Again, just walking through this quickly. But then, once we ended up, this was, so the first part was done by a Chinese student, but this part, the computer modeling, was done by one of our own UMass graduates who also just defended his PhD. So what Mark was able to do is, once he was able to build a model, then we can make these different scenarios and try to understand what parameters are more important within the model. And this is experiments Mark ran on which of, after we did the preliminary analysis, we thought, number of friends that people talk to about mining issues. What he calls close labor ratio here refers to a ratio of how many of your friends live close to you and how many of your friends are far. And then the next factor here being how quickly the early adopters, the people who latch onto the information first, the number of those early adopters that you have in the community. So what we ended up finding was that the close neighbor ratio is much more important. The structure of the social network is much more important than the number of friends and the number of early adopters. That's critical because that means that as a mine, you need to understand the structure of the community, whether it's a rural community that people are related to each other and have clusters, or it's a larger community where people don't necessarily relate to that same. Of course, this is just one example of research that I've been involved in, but there are many, many more things that we don't understand about how mining affects sustainable development. These are some examples of what I consider to be open questions, and I'm sure all of us can put up a list even longer than this. But the point still remains that research has an active role to play if mining is going to be more sustainable, just as professional societies have a role to play. So I'll end by saying we've come far as an industry. There are still challenges. Those challenges require that as professionals we get together and solve the problems that we cannot solve individually, but we only can solve collectively. For example, having ethical standards that we enforce, not only that we have the standards, but when one of us decides to misbehave, we can enforce that in the interest of the integrity of the entire profession. And also things like continue to advance research so we gain a better understanding of how mining can affect sustainable development. And I'll end here, and if I have time, I'll take some questions.
Upon some insights on it, how long does it take you to run a survey?
The survey or the model?
The survey. The model I know you could take faster because you ran the survey. Because the survey and the model, how long does it take you to come out with an output? Start the mine. But before I commence, I want the survey done. I want to make sure I can have all the decisions quickly to make decisions. That's why I'm asking this question.
So I think you have a good point there. There's designing the instrument, there's actually doing the survey, there's analyzing that. And if you want to get all of that done, a good estimate, depending on where you are, I think a good estimate is 6 months.
6 months. Okay, so that means
the reason why we are combining this with modeling is exactly where you are going is you can't wait till you have an issue to understand how dynamic things should be.
Exactly.
Because it takes time to design a survey, right? And for example, the factors we used here may not be the factors you use in Tapa or the factors you use in some other community. So we would have to actually do like we did stakeholder engagement first to understand what factors to use. So it's a lot more complicated than just there's a series of questions that anybody can do.
So at what stage, as a consultant, at what stage will you advise mining companies to bring you into the setting up of the mine?
No, I think community engagement should start the day you show up.
Exactly. That's a very question I want to ask, because my problem I have with mining companies is as a mining company, I will take about 5 to 6 years to develop the mine, and I expect the community to take 3 months to make a decision. And that's a problem that goes around. That's why we're having these community issues coming up. So at least we know that this must start right the very time we have the idea that we want to start exploration. Thank you.
I think we risk our capital when we move forward with large projects without knowing the social risk around that. Now, whether or not at a particular stage we want to do something as sophisticated as this, you don't have to do something this sophisticated to have a community engagement program. But at some point you should have it from day one. And how sophisticated it is becomes, you increase the sophistication as you get closer and closer to a decision to invest.
Atebo Christopher from West of Ghana. Please, I would like to know your opinion whether you recommend that Ghana learn from other countries such as the Philippines, where you account for every ton of material that you take. So once you propose that you want to go into mining and that you'll be excavating this amount of tonnage of material, you're going to pay a certain fee on any ton of material you take. And so that they make sure that you don't just excavate anywhere, but then you account for every tonnage of material that you take. So the question is simply, are you happy with the existing laws of governing the sustainability of the environment? And also, how do we push in, because Ghana, our major issue is with the pollution of water. And water, how do we push in the integrated management of water resources?
So, with regards to the Philippines, I don't know that I necessarily like that approach. Personally, I think if you want to have a sustainable mineral industry, right, you want to have a good regulatory regime. Okay. You want to have a good regulatory regime. There's laws on book, the laws are enforced. Okay. You want to have a good human resource base to feed that industry, because without that, eventually that industry will crumble. We want to have stability in that market, and especially with respect to the regulatory regime. People don't invest in an environment where they don't know tomorrow what the tax regime is going to be, they don't know whether the laws are going to change or not. And remember, capital goes where it's attractive. You and I don't buy things we don't like. Well, nobody puts their money where they don't like the laws, right? And even if I like the laws today, but I don't know what the laws are going to be tomorrow, I have the right to choose where I invest. Ghana is not the only place where there's gold in the ground, right? There are lots of places around the world where there's gold in the ground. Afghanistan, for example, has wonderful resources. Nobody's investing in Afghanistan. So, my point is, just the fact that you are endowed with mineral resources doesn't guarantee your mineral industry will be developed, right? However, underlying all that, I think for our situation is corruption is a hidden factor. We have to, you can have all these things, but if the laws don't work because I can always pay someone off, that's a big issue. Now, your question relates to the regulatory regime. I think our regulatory regime is actually not bad. We look at your reclamation plan before we allow you to permit, right? So you're going to provide us a mining plan with a reclamation plan, and we are satisfied with the reclamation plan, including the impact on water bodies and all that before. And we do have even a mechanism for if you go bankrupt before, how the state can then reclaim. The big question is whether we are actually enforcing those laws the way they should be enforced. And whether, when our regulators show up on site, even the ones that want to do the right thing, they're well trained to know what global best practice is and understand that these are mechanisms, these are ways I can test for acid mine drainage, these are ways I can understand whether the mine is going to have metal mobility in the groundwater and what. So it's not only the laws that you have on the book, that's why I refer to human resource, not only to feed the mines, but also to feed your regulatory regime so that they know what they are doing when it comes to regulations.
Thank you very much. Kofi Bafo Anglo-Vote from WAIC. Offei, I want to know, looking at your presentation, it seems you did your survey and modeling back in the US, whereby the literacy rate is so high. In our context, looking at Obuasi, the legacy issue we have with the community is a community-based mining company. We have trying to take away electricity from a nearby company, the Galamsey issues. How readily can we assess your survey and your modeling, and how easy will it be looking at that electricity issue compared to back then in the US?
Very good point. So certainly you cannot do what we did, which is have the survey online and have people click through it, right? Even then, we had to be careful to ensure that people were not absent-mindedly clicking through, and there are ways to do that. We actually have techniques to catch people who are just clicking through and kick them out of the survey. Definitely, in the Ghana context, you have to sit down with people and explain the choice to them and have them, at least those those, so you would also notice the slide is off that we actually had demographics breakdown. We tried very hard to match the demographics of the community. So we went to census data and we knew what the demographics of the community, at least in relation to the four demographic factors that we had. Our earlier research had indicated that those demographic factors were important: age, gender, income levels, and education level. We had done earlier work that indicated that those four were important demographic factors. So we tried to match those four. So to buttress your point, you don't want to survey only the educated people when you have a community of high literacy. But that means you have to handhold in an objective and fair way, because you don't want the person hand-holding the guy also to influence the result that they tell you, otherwise you get me. So yes, there are challenges, and I believe it will be a bit more expensive and time-consuming, but it can be done.